Okay. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا، إنه من يهديه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد. Okay, so last week we covered the Battle of Badr in some detail and the effects of the Muslim Islamic victory at Badr. And I covered quite a few verses from the Quran that spoke about certain events before and during Badr. And some of these verses talked about some of the things, the factors that tools, I guess, that Allah used to help bring about the Islamic victory. So some of these verses talk about Allah, for example, allowing the Islamic army to rest, sleeping very well the night before Badr. Talks about how the enemy army, in the view of the Muslims, was made to appear smaller than usual. The Muslims felt that they weren't fighting 1,000, they were fighting maybe 100 people only. It appeared to them. Of course, other verses in the Quran talk about how Allah sent thousands of angels. From 1,000 it increased to 3,000 to 5,000. Even talked about, even in the Quran, during the battle, how the mushrikeen, the enemy army, felt they were fighting a huge Muslim army instead of fighting only 313. We talked about some of the tactics that the Muslims used, how the Muslims took control of the water wells at Badr and destroyed some of them, the ones that were near the Qurayshi army. And this was done on purpose. This was a tactic of war to prevent your enemy from having water. So they were dying of thirst. Another Muslim tactic was to target the leaders of Quraysh, either for killing or for capture. So Abu Jahl was killed in battle. Umayyah ibn Khalaf was killed in battle. And just before the battle, they had the jewels. You had the Utbah ibn Rabi'a and his brother and his son that were killed in the duel. So these were all important people in Quraysh. And even there were some important people who were captured, important people at the end of the battle. So such as Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet, who had secretly converted, but he was forced to go and fight on the Qurayshi army. But in the end, he was captured. We talked about how the Prophet organized the Islamic army into formations, something the Arabs had never done before in their history. So in rows, for example. This was nothing new in world history, but to the Arabs this was new. I covered some of the differences between historical reality and how it was portrayed in the movie, the message. This was Abu Jahl in the movie by himself riding a horse, whereas in the actual battle, Abu Jahl was actually on foot and he was surrounded by armed men, a sea of armed men. And yet he was still killed, not by one man like here, but by two young teenage boys, one 13, one 14-year-olds. The effects of the Muslim victory, I mentioned, this was huge. So it was the real birth of the Islamic nation. It also brought about a humiliation to Quraysh. Quraysh also suffered not only humiliation, but they lost that prestige that they used to have in the Arabian Peninsula. Because not only were they one of the most powerful tribes in the whole Arabian Peninsula, they were the custodians of the Kaaba, the Holy Mosque. Them being defeated in Badr by a smaller army was a huge was a humiliation to them. Now Quraysh lost. There were 70 of them were killed in battle, and 70 were even captured by the Muslim side. And of course, this caused a lot of resentment, a lot of anger amongst Quraysh in Mecca, that they wanted to avenge their defeat at Badr. And the death of Abu Lahab wasn't at the battle, but 7 nights after Badr, he died. And it was a very horrible death, and wasn't a dignified burial even. Because when he died, he died of a disease that the Arabs didn't know much about, and they feared it was very contagious. So they wouldn't even approach the body of Abu Lahab. Abu Lahab was the uncle of the Prophet who fought against him, hated his own nephew. And he died, and for 3 days they left his body to rot. They were too afraid to approach the body, pick it up and bury it. After 3 days, the body is rotting away, stinking. They dug his grave, and without even touching the body, using sticks or logs or whatever, they pushed the body into the grave and threw stones onto the body. The battle also brought an economic crisis to Mecca, because Medina was right in the middle of the caravan trade routes from Mecca to Syria. One other thing is the booty, the spoils of war. So at the end of the battle, the Muslims quarreled amongst each other about who should actually take possession of the booty. So this verse came down, and the Prophet Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made a decision to divide the booty into 5 parts. 4/5 of it would go to the army, and 1/5 to go to the Prophet to dispose of it in any way he saw fit. And one last thing was the prisoners of war. So there was some disagreement. The Prophet held a meeting, because there was some disagreement because they had not yet received revelation on how to treat their prisoners of war. So the Prophet is consulting the Sahaba, and Sayyidina Abu Bakr said we should ransom them, we should not kill them, whereas Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab was of the opinion to execute them all. And the Prophet decided to go with Abu Bakr's opinion and to ransom them. And then the following day, the Prophet received revelation, this verse from the Quran, basically saying it was better for him to execute the prisoners. It doesn't mean that the Prophet did was wrong, that the Prophet's decision was wrong. There's another verse that says you can still ransom them, but in that case, it would have been better for the Muslims to execute their prisoners. A couple of miraculous incidents as well. So Abbas, as I said, was in the Quraysh army. He was captured. He was a prisoner, and he's speaking to the Prophet. He's saying, because he has to ransom himself, so he's saying to the Prophet, "I can't afford the ransom money. It's too much." So, and because he not only had to ransom himself, he had to ransom 3 other people. He was a wealthy man. So the Prophet replies to him, says, "What about the conversation you had with your wife before you left Mecca to fight?" So he was referring to a private conversation that Abbas had with his own wife, saying that if I die in battle, there's this money, this huge amount of money, I'm burying it somewhere, and he tells her where it is, and you just leave off that money. It's a lot of money. But the point is that it was a private conversation, nobody else knew about it. And somehow the Prophet found out about it. How? Because of revelation. So in this case, Abu Abbas, he said, I confirm that you are a true prophet of Allah. But the Prophet still insisted that Abbas pay his ransom, because there was no favoritism with the Prophet. So the Prophet was fair. If everybody else had to ransom, even his uncle had to also ransom himself, even if he was related to him by blood. The other miraculous conversation the Prophet had was with Suhail ibn Amr, with Umayr ibn Wahb. Umayr ibn Wahb his son was at Badr, and his son was captured. Umayr ibn Wahb was friends with Safwan ibn Umayyah. So Umayyah ibn Khalaf. Umayyah ibn Khalaf was the same person who tortured Bilal. So this is the son of Umayyah. Safwan and Ibn Umayyah and Umayyah ibn Wahab were close friends. So Umayyah ibn Wahab is complaining, saying, I wish I could kill the Muhammad. So, but I can't go because of two things. Number one, he's got many children to feed, and secondly, because he's got a lot of debts. So Safwan offers to take care of both things, problems for him in one go. He is able to pay off all his debts and look after his children, on condition that Umayyah ibn Wahab would go to Medina and assassinate the Prophet. And Umayyah ibn Wahab had the excuse that he was going to Medina to take his son, because his son was a prisoner. So he goes all the way to Medina, and he comes and meets the Prophet face to face. And of course, some of the other Sahaba saw him, and they knew that he was up to no good. He had evil intentions. But the Prophet still got him to sit in front of him. And Umayyah says, I'm here to ransom my son. And the Prophet says, tell me what you're really here for. Tell me the truth. And then he tells him about the secret the conversation that he had with Safwan ibn Umayyah, that you're going to kill me, and he would to take care of all his problems, his debts and all that. And that was at that point that Umayyah ibn Wahab converted. At that point, there was so the Islamic victory brought about a lot of prestige, a lot of respect to the Muslims, but not everybody, not with all the tribes. So there were some tribes that still wanted to fight the Muslims. Bani Sulaim was one of those tribes. They're not far from Medina, and so they sent threats to Medina. The Prophet marched out with an army, and as soon as they got to the place where they were supposed to fight, they found the other tribe had run away. They escaped. They were too scared to fight them. So now we'll continue with today's lesson. So 10 months after, I think I mentioned this, no. So as I mentioned before, the economic impact was huge on Mecca. So the trade routes, not only to the north but to the south, was also affected, because the caravans would go to one area, one place, buy goods, and go to the other place to sell them. So if they can't go in one way, one direction, they can't. The trade is completely stopped. So Quraysh wanted to try something new. They would try to go a longer route. Instead of Mecca, straight from Mecca through Medina, from Mecca to Medina, they tried to go the longer route through Najd, a longer distance through Iraq to Syria. Of course, the Muslims found out, and they sent out a party. They captured that caravan, even though it was a long way from Medina. The Muslims had very good intelligence sources. And that particular caravan was carrying 100,000 dinars worth of goods, and the Muslims captured it. Now we'll go on to the Jewish reaction in Medina. So in Medina you had three Jewish tribes, Bani Qaynuqa, Bani Nadir, Bani Qurayza, and they were so far been hostile to the Muslims. Even though the Prophet had tried his best to create some sort of a good relationship with the Jews, and he even made a treaty with the Jews. This was partly a defense treaty. The Jews were not happy with that, and they tried their best to try and annul the treaty. And they were very hostile to the extent that they were abusive to the Prophet, abusive to the wives of the Sahaba, sorry. Bani Qaynuqa would say to the Prophet, don't be deluded at Badr on account of defending some Qurayshis inexperienced in the art of war. If you engage us in a fight, you will realize that we are genuine war experts. So the Jews are saying to the Prophet, those Qurayshis, they couldn't fight. But if you come and fight us, you'll find that we are much better, good at fighting. It was an indirect threat to the Prophet. Now, the Jews didn't stop there. The situation escalated. So the story is that a Muslim woman went to the Jewish marketplace at Banu Qaynuqa. She's buying some things, and some of the Jews there were trying to tell her to take off her headscarf. Of course, she was refused. They kept insisting. She refused, until they were able to somehow tie her hijab to something, the wall or something. And when she got up, it pulled her off the hijab of her head, and she was exposed. Of course, she didn't like it. A Muslim man nearby saw what happened, and he went to fight for her honor. He killed that man, the Jewish man who was responsible for tying her hijab. He kills him on the spot. So the other Jews in the area see this, they come and kill that Muslim man. And so this is now causing a fight now, Muslims and Jews. This all occurred 1 month after Badr. The Prophet, once he hears about this, he gathers an army and lays siege to Banu Qaynuqa. So the three Jewish tribes had their own fortifications. Each tribe had its own fortification within Medina. So the Prophet comes with an army and lays siege to Banu Qaynuqa. So this is, in addition to Banu Qaynuqa being abusive and hostile to the Muslims, they did this, that thing they did with the Muslim woman, and then they killed the Muslim man, is all indication that they were not interested in keeping a good relationship with the Muslims, and they weren't interested in maintaining the treaty. So the Prophet lays siege to them, and finally, after 2 weeks, they surrender. So the Prophet wanted to execute all the men. Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, Abdullah ibn Ubay, so he was the one who was going to be elected as king of Medina before the Prophet immigrated. He had a very close relationship with Banu Qaynuqa, and when he heard that the Prophet wanted to execute all of Banu Qaynuqa, he went to the Prophet to try and intercede on their behalf, because he had a good relationship with Banu Qaynuqa. And he even tried to forcibly, held the prophets with his arms, says, "Let them go." The Prophet said, "Unhand me, do not lay your hands on me." And he did, and then the Prophet agreed to not execute them on condition that Banu Qaynuqa would all evacuate Medina, never come back. And that was agreed. They all left. Now this relationship is actually mentioned in the Quran, Surah Al-Hashr, in a couple of verses. Allah talks about the Jews, those who disbelieved amongst the Jews, and their brothers from next to the munafiqeen, the hypocrites. Allah says they were brothers. The Jews, the disbelieving Jews, and the hypocrites. Of course, the Prophet did what he had to do, because he took decisive action. He couldn't just leave the Jews to do whatever they wanted. They would have increased in their hostile acts. So the Prophet had to try and put an end to it, so he took decisive action. Now, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf was from another Jewish tribe, Banu Nadir. He was one of the VIPs of that tribe. He was also extremely hostile, even more hostile than Banu Qaynuqa. He would insult the Prophet. He composed poetry in which he would attack the Prophet. And he even went out of Medina, even though he had to get permission from the Prophet. He would go out, meet the Arab tribes, and try and instigate them, to try and convince them, encourage them to go and fight against the Muslims. He even went all the way to Quraysh in Mecca, to encourage them to fight. So he went to Quraysh and he said, you should go and fight the Muslims. Quraysh then would ask him, do you think which of us do you think is more rightly guided? They're asking this Jewish person, Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf. Muhammad or us, the pagans? So Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf says, you, the idolaters, the idol worship of the pagans are more guided than Muhammad. So Allah actually revealed this verse from the Quran. Says, yet believe in the Prophet, have you not seen those who were given a portion of the scriptures, the Jews that is, yet believe in idols and false gods, and reassure the disbelievers that they are better guided than the believers. He even composed poetry attacking the purity of the wives of the prophets. That's how vile he was. So because of that, the Prophet ordered for him to be assassinated. And they were able to assassinate him. But the Prophet did not punish the whole tribe, because from the tribe of Bani Nadir. The Prophet did not believe in collective punishment, because it was only him who was going around abusing the Prophet and the Muslims. The rest of the tribe did not do that, did not partake in that same activity. And even after Ka'b ibn Ashraf was assassinated, they sent a delegation of the Prophet to renew the treaty between them, the Jews, the Bani Nadir and the Muslims. So going back to Quraysh, now 1 year later, they're still angry about their defeat at Badr, and they prepare a new army of 3,000 to go fight the Muslims. With his army, there are 15 women traveling with the army. Amongst them is Hind bint Utbah, wife of Abu Sufyan. And Bani Abd Dar, yes. So there was one tribe called Bani Abd Dar that were responsible for carrying the banner, the flag of Quraysh. And we'll go back to Bani Abd Dar. Now with Uhud, this is the new battle. The Muslims, the situation was very different to Badr, even though there was some similarities in the beginning of Uhud and the Battle of Badr. With Uhud, the Muslims, now as soon as the Quraysh had prepared their army of 3,000, the news went straight to Medina. The Muslims found out soon afterwards that Quraysh were preparing an army to come fight them. So they had time to prepare themselves for war, for battle. And they prepared an army of 1,000. Now, the Muslims now were preparing an army for war. Whereas at Badr, when the Muslim army left Medina, they weren't going out to fight a war. They were going out to capture a caravan. So they weren't as well armed. They were lightly armed. They were going out to capture a caravan. Whereas at Uhud, they were expecting a war, and they properly armed themselves. They had armor, body armor, and swords and everything. The other advantage for the Muslims is that, of course, the distance. Uhud was a short distance from Medina, about 20 kilometers. The Qurayshi army had to travel 500 kilometers from Mecca all the way to Uhud. The morale of the Muslim army again was also very high. Whereas the Quraysh, again, the morale was not very high. It was not high at all. So the Prophet, before they leave Medina, has another meeting. He's consulting the Muslims about where to fight, where they should fight. And there are two opinions. They should either stay in Medina and fight the mushrikeen, let the Meccan army arrive at Medina itself and allow the battle to happen in Medina, or they could march out of Uhud, out of Medina to Uhud and fight. And yes, the Prophet narrated a dream that he saw. He saw a cow getting slaughtered. He saw slight damage occurring to his sword, and and the third thing he saw was putting his hand inside some body armor. So the Prophet interpreted this as the cow getting slaughtered as someone from the Sahaba would be killed in battle, and the damage to his own sword, he understood that to mean someone related to him would be killed in battle, and him putting his hand inside the armor meant the battle would occur within Medina. Now, as I said, there were two opinions as where they should fight. The Prophet was of the opinion that they should stay in Medina, but the majority of the Sahaba, the people there, majority, not all of them, were of the opinion they should go fight outside of Medina at Uhud, including his uncle Hamza radiallahu anhu. So one person who was in agreement with the Prophet was Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul. He's not a Sahabi, of course. Technically, he's not a Sahabi, but anyway. So the Prophet went with the majority, the opinion of the majority. The majority wanted to go out and fight outside of Medina. So he agreed. And later, some of the Muslims went to him and said they regretted. They said we should not have. We feel like we're imposing our opinion on you. You know, we're happy with whatever decision you make. The Prophet says, "You've made the decision. Now we're going to go out and fight." This was the decision of the majority. So as I said, the Muslim army was 1,000 when they left Medina. So they're marching out of Medina, and they're trying to get to Uhud, taking a route where they wouldn't be discovered, seen marching. So as soon as just before they arrived at Uhud, Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, who was in the army, he says, he decides, I was of the opinion that we should stay in Medina. We should have stayed in Medina. I don't agree with this decision, and I'm going to withdraw from the army. And he takes 300 of his followers out of the army, and they go back to Medina. So the army is now is now been reduced to 700 instead of 1,000. And that was actually mentioned in this Quranic verse. That's the map of the battlefield. You can see that's Mount Uhud there. That's the Muslim camp, and that's the Qurayshi camp. And that's the famous hill of the archers. And the cavalry. I'm not sure what this is. Maybe that's just the camp. I'm not sure. Oh, that's the camp actually, Qurayshi camp. So this is the Qurayshi army, 3,000 versus 700. So the Prophet deliberately chose this to place the Muslim army here. He had a mountain behind him, here and there, and so this was really the weak spot here, this hill actually. So he chose that so they wouldn't be routed, easily routed. They had to have, so the Prophet saw that the Qurayshis had cavalry, and he knew that what the Qurayshis were intending to do, to attack the Muslims from behind, so he placed 50 archers on that hill. So the Prophet now has selected 50 archers under the command of Abdullah ibn Jubayr. And he's speaking to these 50 archers. And he gives them very, very precise instructions on what to do in the battle. He's saying to them, all 50, protect us from the cavalry, the Qurayshi cavalry, by shooting them with arrows, so they don't come behind us. Now, whether we win or lose in the battle, do not leave your positions. Even if you see all of us dead, and the birds coming down, the vultures, whatever, eating our corpses, don't move from that hill. Even if you see us victorious, do not leave that hill. The instructions were so precise that they could not have been misunderstood or interpreted indifferently. And not only that, it was as if the Prophet had an idea of what might happen in the battle, how the battle could turn out. So he gave those instructions. The Prophet was also encouraging the army to fight hard, as at Badr, saying, fight, jihad, you die as a shaheed, as a martyr, there is paradise for you. And even offers a sword, a particular sword, to whoever he will take it and use it properly, like kill with it. And Abu Dujana is one who takes the sword from him. Abu Dujana, that's his full name there, Abu Dujana Samnak ibn Kharsha. The Prophet instructs him to use the sword until it breaks. Abu Dujana, before the battle, he's famous. He ties a red piece of material around his head, and he's walking around being strong and tough, intended to showing off, to scare the enemy. And the Prophet says, normally Allah would not like what he's doing, the way he's walking around like this, but in this situation, Allah loves it. Because the way he's doing it, walking, he's scaring the enemy. This is from the movie, The Message. Now this is one thing the movie actually got right. But there's a catch. This is from the Arabic version of the movie. That the person in front is Hind on the horse. And she's coming in front of the army to encourage them, to carry them to fight. Now, in the Arabic version, she's reciting poetry. And this is what happened. In the English version, she didn't recite poetry, she just did a couple of lines there. But this was typical of the Arabs at the time. They were obsessed with poetry. Even in battle, poetry. Even in the midst of the battle itself, poetry. Even if somebody was about to get executed, now without even war, battle, he's about to die, he's going to get chopped off or something, he recites a few lines of poetry. It was strange, but how the Arabs lived, but they were obsessed with poetry. But Hind, in order to encourage the Qurayshi army to fight, she's reciting some beautiful poetry, lines of poetry. So Uhud begins on Saturday, 7th of Shawwal. I mentioned before Bani Abd al-Dar, the tribe of Bani Abd al-Dar, have been responsible for carrying the banner of the Qurayshi army. They carried it, and each person who carries it gets killed by the Muslims. Next person from the same tribe picks up the flag, the banner, gets killed. Up to 10 people from the same family get killed at Badr. After all 10, a servant from their tribe, of their tribe, picks up the flag, carries it again. Even he gets killed. His arms get chopped off, his head gets chopped off. And now he was the last person to carry the Qurayshi banner. It fell on the ground, and nobody from Quraysh would pick up the banner again. Now, Uhud, the Muslims dominated the battlefield right from the beginning, unlike in the movie. The movie shows the two sides fighting, and it was only after Hamza got killed that the Muslims were so, I don't know, not demoralized, wanted to avenge his death, that they started fighting harder, and then they started defeating the Qurayshis. Actually, from what I just mentioned, Bani Abd al-Dar lost 10 people of their own tribe carrying the banner. It meant that from the beginning, the Muslims would dominate the battlefield. It shows you the genius of the Prophet. The Prophet, who had only 700 fighting an army of 3,000. And not only that, 300 people had withdrawn from the army before even the battle began. So any other place, any other time, people would have saw this as a bad sign that maybe the battle will be lost. The Prophet shows you the Prophet was a genius in the battlefield. Abu Dujana with the sword, and the one who's the enemy was scared of. He is fighting hard, he's killing. And not only that, he's reciting poetry as he's fighting and killing. Not only that, he's fighting so hard, he managed to penetrate the Qurayshi army up to the very rear of the army. That's how hard he fought. And when he reached the end of the army, the rear of the army, he raised his sword, he's about to kill somebody, he realized that person is a woman. And he decides not to kill this woman. He realizes it's Hind. He said, I didn't want to stain the sword of the Prophet with the blood of a woman. That's all I have for tonight. But inshallah, we'll cover a bit more about Badr and some of the heroic things that the Muslims did, and what Allah called, because Uhud would have been a victory, an Islamic victory, had it not been for certain people who disobeyed the direct command of the Prophet. This command, the instructions the Prophet gave them, which were very clear, and yet they disobeyed, and that led to a defeat. But until that point, so far, the victory, Uhud resembled Badr in certain ways, certain ways. The Muslim morale was very high. They had thinking of paradise, of shahada, fighting, and quite a few different things that was similar. Inshallah, we'll cover that next time. Any questions or any comments from anybody? Or?
I think when the Jew guy, what they did to
Yep.
worse than just the hijab. He actually tied her hijab to her dress. So
Yeah.
she got up,
Yep.
legs showed, so she dropped to the ground. That's when the Sahaba came and killed him. So it was worse than just the hijab.
Ah, yeah. So not just her hair was covered,
Yeah, just
the body?
yeah, her dress went up. So
Ah, okay.
she dropped to the ground. That's what I read from Rahik al-Maktoum.
Ah, yeah. Ah, Rahiq al-Maktoum. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Jazakumullah khair. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. ستذكرون ما أقول لكم